Hey guys, so it's that time again where I look at the rogue decks that were played among the top 100 ranked players on Dueling Book through the help of ygeoscope.com in what I call a rogue analysis. So if you want to see this kind of rogue analysis every month or two, make sure to subscribe. I will also release a similar video soon where I go through what the top ranked 25 players are playing, which I plan to work on after we give some time for players to start using the new cards from Lightning Overdrive. Anyways, let's begin. Now, to kick things off, defining a deck as rogue can be unclear at times. For this video, I decided to not include the following decks as they were considered tiers 1 and 2, which I based it off on some of the recent tier list videos that were available. Some of the clear ones include tier 1 decks like Dragon Link, Dogmatica, Invoke Shaddoll, and Prank Kids. Then you have other strong decks like Dinos, and the Eldritch picture more or less represents Eldritch Zodiac, and I suppose Eldritch Dragoon or Dogmatica Eldritch as well. The Tri-Brigade picture also really represents Tri-Brigade Zodiac, but I also have Pure Zodiac on here this time around. This is because on ygeoscope, while for the most part it can distinguish between the different Zodiac decks, sometimes it doesn't, and so to be safe I decided to just not include the Pure Zoo as rogue either. As for Virtual World, I would like to consider them as rogue, but I did notice that other tier list videos, they still seem to be putting this deck as tier 2, so I just decided to go with that. Again, the definition of rogue is not perfect, and some definitely will disagree with my categorization, and I get that, but I don't think it will ever be perfect and be able to cater to everyone's expectations. So now this was the breakdown of the matches that involved rogue decks among players that were in the top 100 in ranking on Dueling Book. This pie chart is based on 410 matches from 29 different players that played a rogue deck, and the data was based on May 30th. So we have Mech Knights being the most popular, and not all of these were Invoke variants either. Most were the traditional going second builds, but there was that one player that played a more going first control type of Mech Knights with some floodgates. Phantom Knight Burning Abyss took up about 14% of the matches included in this video, and is certainly a strong combo deck that has some control aspects to it with the Fog Blades and just a really grindy deck. They also typically play Dragoon as well, and you can check out my most recent video on how often you win when a player summons Dragoon, and I'll link that below. Next up we have Math Mech, where the matches were contributed by two different players. They're always the same players that show up on my meta or rogue analysis, so clearly they are very good players that can fight with the best of them using a rogue deck. And then we have Infernoble, which has typically been the most popular rogue decks in my rogue analysis. Then we have Altergeist, which is typically just a really popular deck on Dueling Book in general across all decks, not just among rogue. And then you have a bunch of other decks like Subterra Dragoon, ABC as always as courtesy of Pure 555, Buster Blader Dragoon, Frogs, Medolce, Mermail, Sky Striker, and a variety of other decks where the matches they contributed was less than 2%, and this included decks like Salamangreat, Cyber Dragon, Necros, and even Cosmo. Now our top ranked players using their rogue decks won about 68% of the matches, which is pretty impressive and in line with my previous rogue analysis numbers. As for the playstyle of the deck that they played, pretty even split among the combo and control decks at 37 to 38%. Now this has partly to do with the fact that I categorize Math Mech as a beatdown strategy. To be honest with you, I don't know this deck too well, and when I asked in the comments in my last rogue analysis on how Math Mech should be categorized, I got conflicting responses, so I kept it as beatdown for now. Feel free to let me know otherwise though. Speaking of beatdown, that took up about 25% of the playstyles, where aside from Math Mech, Mech Knights also contributed to this section, except for that one going first Mech Knight build that was categorized as control since it played Floodgates. Now when our top ranked rogue players won the die roll, they decided to go first 84% of the time, since we did have some going second Mech Knight builds. Conversely, if our top ranked players lost the die roll, they still did get to go first for game 1 13% of the time, so not all hope is lost if you lose a die roll for all you combo players. If we were to look at the win percentage for the overall match based on whether you won or lost the die roll, if you won the die roll, our players won 72% of the matches, but if they lost the die roll, they won 65% of the matches. So not that big of a gap actually, and part of that would be driven by the fact that going second decks like Mech Knight don't care if they win or lose the die roll. So as usual, let's just cover the top 5 most played decks in a bit more detail, but remember that we are always dealing with small sample sizes for these kind of videos. Now our top ranked players that played Mech Knights overall won 65% of the matches, so pretty solid. It's a fun deck that really forces your opponent to be careful about their card placement, because if you put more than one card in the same column, then you are going to get punished by Mech Knights, as they'll be able to plus on your mistakes. If they won the die roll, they won 64% of the matches, whereas if they lost the die roll, it was pretty much similar at 67%. Again, since most Mech Knight builds traditionally aim to go second, winning or losing the die roll typically does not matter for them. Now I used to provide win-loss percentages based on the different playstyle of decks that they faced, but I decided not to present that anymore as we always dealt with way too small of sample sizes for that to get any reliable estimates. Instead, I decided to just show what the performance of each deck was in the last 7 days on Dueling Book among all players, not just the top ranked players. These numbers are something that's available straight from YGOscope.com. So in the last 7 days, Mech Knights were the 30th most played deck overall. So this is among all decks, not just rogue decks. In that same period, the deck won 52% of the matches. So obviously this number will almost always be lower than what you see among our top ranked players because, well, this 52% includes all the good and bad players that play this deck on Dueling Book. Next, we have Phantom Knight Burning Abyss, which is a fan favorite deck it seems. With the unbanning of Rusty and the release of Torn Scales in Phantom Rage, the deck saw a lot of play even among some of the top players like Jesse Cotton. The deck goes hand in hand with the Burning Abyss monsters really well, and Dragoon is a big part of your end board with your multiple Fog Blades for that extra monster effect negation. Overall, our top players that played this deck won 72% of their matches, quite impressive considering its rogue status. Definitely a deck that wants to go first, and it won 82% of their matches when the player won the die roll, while winning 63% of the time when they lost the die roll. In the last 7 days, this deck, which is categorized as Burning Abyss Red Eyes on YGOscope, was the 20th most played deck overall and had a win rate of 60% among all players using this deck, so that is still a pretty high win percentage considering that it is based on all players. Next up is MathMech, and as I mentioned before, the 40 matches were contributed by 2 players, and they just always seem to be ranked high on Dueling Book time after time with this deck. I really should learn more about this deck if I'm going to see this on a recurring basis in these kind of videos, since I still don't really know what they do. This time around, the deck won 70% of their matches, so these 2 players were doing really well at the time that I collected the data. Funnily enough, when they won the die roll, they won 63% of the time, whereas they did slightly better when they lost the die roll at 75%. Small sample size though, of course, so that most likely explains the difference. In terms of performance in the last 7 days for this deck across all players, unfortunately that data is just not available. This is because I noticed that YGOscope has not been able to identify MathMech, but it just classifies as undefined. So hopefully the people working that site can make it so it can automatically flag it as MathMech and give it the respect that it deserves. Next up, we have Noble Knight, which to be honest with you can still do a good amount of hand rips now with Omega and looping it with DDR. Definitely not a deck I want to go up against. I still respect it, and certainly so since it did win 76% of their matches this time around. If it won the die roll, they were just automatic at 91% win rate compared to just 53% when they lost the die roll. In the last 7 days, it was the 21st most played deck on Dueling Book with a 61% win rate. Again, this is pretty impressive, and it's been a pretty popular rogue deck of choice, and I think it's still really strong. And finally, we have Altergeist. Ever since its tier 1 status a few years ago, it's just always been a solid deck, and you always see it top a tournament here and there. Overall, it won 79% of the matches among the top players that play this deck, so certainly very high, but of course this is only based on 28 matches. Whether they won or lost the die roll, they actually had an equal win-loss percentage this time around at 79%. Perfectly balanced as all things should be. I think we've come to learn that since the VFT format, that traps are just really strong and it's fine even if you go second with them. You can still break some boards when paired with something like Solemn Strike. Lastly, in the past 7 days, it was actually the 7th most played deck on Dueling Book overall. It's just always been a really popular deck, and even when Multi-Faker was at 1, it was still popular. Overall though, it won just 56% of the matches among all players, but considering how so many players are running the deck, I don't think you can expect too high of a win percentage either as a rogue deck. Alright guys, so that was it for another round of my rogue analysis. Stay tuned for my monthly meta analysis that I'll make within the next couple of weeks, and let's see if decks like Drytron and Scrap Dinos make it among the top ranked players. Take care guys.